Should the US tolerate Iran's weapons program? My argument, grounded in the work of Martha Gilles Deleuze, is that yes, indeed, the US needs to tolerate the Iranian weapons program. So let us get into this sort of interesting endeavor. So, first and foremost, what I'm going to say, and it needs to be said out loud, is that Iran is not building nuclear weapons. This is a total lie. And we can get into this, but basically it goes like this. Definitionally, any nuclear program is building nuclear weapons. I'll try and explain it. So basically, this is how it works, okay? You got my hand, right? And it's made of atoms. Now, between atoms is space, empty space. What holds atoms together is a universal electrical field. This is sort of mind-bending stuff, I know. Don't ever make the mistake of trying to read books on quantum physics, because it will just destroy your brain. But I went ahead and did that, so I'm going to tell you the insights. Yeah, again, I warn you against trying to read this stuff, because it's just, ugh. So basically, there is a universal electrical field that holds all atoms together, and atoms are divided by space in between them. Now, the element of uranium is a metal that has the least amount of space between its atoms. Okay? So, when you enrich uranium, what you're doing is you're closing the space between atoms. If that makes sense. And so that is what enriched uranium is. It's a highly technical process. Now, in order to get enough enrichment for nuclear power, it's about usually between 2 and 10%. The reason why that is because when you shoot a neutron through the uranium, the neutron, so this is how you split an atom, is you have an atom, and you shoot the neutron at the atom, and it splits the atom, and that unleashes the power of the atom, the sun, essentially. It's power equivalent to the sun. And that is what you're unleashing. Now, you gotta fire a shit ton of neutrons in order to get this to happen. So it's a sort of wasteful process. And so you have to enrich the uranium, meaning close the space between the atoms in order to actually hit an atom, if that makes sense. Okay, now that we've sort of discussed what nuclear actually is, because a lot of people don't know what nuclear is, what needs to be understood is that in order to be able to get a bomb, a nuclear bomb, you need to have enrichment that's at 99%. For whatever reason, don't ask me why, you can't get enrichment at 100%. I don't know why. You just can't. So, you need enrichment at 99%. Most people, most countries, companies, whatever, are not capable of doing this. Enrichment is an incredibly hard and intensive process, and it requires the expertise of key individuals that, there's only a handful of them in terms of the world. They are few and far between. And so, Iran does not possess that capability. In fact, Israel has nuclear weapons, but they built them using enriched uranium that was stolen off of the US. Do you see what I'm saying? And so, enriched uranium that is at 99% in level of enrichment is a scarce commodity in terms of the world. It's this thing that every state wants to get their hands on. It's not easy to come across, and because it's so hard to make, and the individuals that can make it for you under lock and key. They, yeah, you will not find them. I'll put it that way. And so, most countries with a nuclear stockpile, they are relying upon enriched uranium that they obtain through theft or whatever, but they don't have the ability to make any more. And so that's sort of the reason why I say that is because I want to make it clear that the lie that you're being told that Iran is making nuclear weapons is exactly that. It's a lie. It's a complete lie. So, now that we've sort of debunked that and we've settled that, my position is that the US needs to tolerate Iran's weapons program. Why is that? Well, let's go forward. So I'm going to offer you an argument grounded in Martin Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher. And so Deleuze argued that systems of control tend toward paranoia, interpreting every external force as a threat. And we can see this, for example, in various empires in human history. The Romans, the definitely Imperial Japan, not so much the Persians, but they were more a corporation than an empire when you think about it. Ironically, the ancestors of today's Iran. So, if we view Iran's weapons development as inherently aggressive, this reflects paranoid framework. In reality, international politics is a multiplicity of actors seeking stability, not a simple good versus evil narrative. So that is Deleuze's sort of view of international relations, is that it's not the sort of stage of like a moral drama of good and evil, but a field of interacting forces and desires, what Martin Deleuze called assemblage, which is these different basically he argued that states are not unified moral actors but machines of power and survival embedded in global flows of capital, military capability, and security anxiety. So within this sort of Deleuzian framework, the conflict between the United States and Iran can be interpreted as a clash between the state security machines, each attempting to stabilize itself within an unpredictable geopolitical environment. So let me sort of get into more so the paranoid state versus the schizophrenic reality. This is a sort of fun bit of trivia from Martin Deleuze in which he talks about how schizophrenia is actually a liberating thing and that it is not paranoia that is inherent in schizophrenia, but that schizophrenia actually liberates people from paranoia. Okay, this is sort of an interesting way of going about things, and if you understand continental philosophy, then you understand that there's a tendency to invert things, right? To take things and invert them. So don't just dismiss what he's saying. Appreciate this as a different sort of cultural and philosophical framework by which to look at the world. So basically what he argued is that present in the form of Oedipus, the Greek guy who, with his mum, I'm not going to say that for, ratings reasons, but you know what I'm talking about. Basically, that he sort of embodied sort of paranoid systems of control, and that he was against the schizophrenic nature of reality. What does that mean exactly? So, Oedipus, the king, tried to control everything, including his own mother. Yeah. And what Martin Deleuze means by the schizophrenic nature of reality is that reality is plural and fluid and impossible to fully contain. And so, therefore, a paranoid system or individual tries to centralize control, impose rigid narratives, and interpret every external development as a threat. That is what they would try to do. Exemplary in the person of Oedipus. And so, When we apply this framework geopolitically, a paranoid state framework interprets another country's military capacity only through suspicion and preemption. So, from this pair of eyes, this Deleuzian pair of eyes, the dominant discourse in Washington treats Iran's weapons development as inherently aggressive rather than as a normal function of state survival. So instead of saying, perhaps Iran are trying to survive, the narrative is they're trying to screw us over. Do you see what I'm saying? And so he would argue that you need more schizophrenia and less paranoia, okay, in Washington. So Martin Deleuze argues that such thinking misreads the multiplicity of motivations within global assemblage. And so, again, we talked about how states are not unified moral actors. Martin Deleuze would say that a state is an assemblage of different motivations. And so this is definitely the case with Iran. I mean, it's in the name, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it just says right there, right, that they have three motivations. They have Islam, their interpretation, Shia Islam, republicanism in some sort of form, and pride, ethnic pride, Iranian. Let's unite the Iranian peoples. For those who don't know much about the word or name Iran, it's the name of the region. And so the different groups that are living there, Balochi, Persian, Afghani, they are known as Iranian peoples. And so the modern nation state of Iran adopted the name Iran. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's kind of like Oceania. And let's say New Zealand were to rename itself Oceania because the region of that part of the world is called Oceania, and the peoples of that region are the oceanic peoples, right? And so that would be an example as to what Iran is. And so Iran is a prime example of what Martin Deleuze talks about when he says an assemblage, that being an assembly of motivations and desires sort of unified in one state actor. We have Islam, we have republicanism, and we have ethnic pride sort of merged into this one thing. So, what he argues as well is that there is a multiplicity of motivations within global assemblage. And so states build capacities not simply to dominate, but to maintain their own lines of existence. That these are sort of two truths that, yes, the US wants to dominate by having a large military, but the US also wants to survive. And so I think there's what Martin Deleuze wants us to do is to stop thinking in purely moralistic terms. And that's sort of what he's talking about there when it comes to international relations. And so the universal logic of the war machine. So Martin Deleuze describes the war machine, what he calls the war machine, as a structure that exists independently of the state, but is often appropriated by states. A little bit hard to wrap your head around. So every state eventually internalizes some form of war machine, even peaceful nations, and I'll get into that soon. Because sovereignty requires deterrence, vulnerability invites domination, and geopolitical competition forces adaptation. So in this sense, Iran's development of military capabilities is not exceptional. It reflects the same logic followed historically by nearly every state in human history, including the United States itself. The question, therefore, becomes not whether states will arm themselves, but how other states respond to that inevitability. No, I just said that every state will internalize a war machine, as Martin Deleuze argues, including the so-called pacifist nations. And so here's a prime example that I love to use. Switzerland. People think of Switzerland, Schweizer, and they often think of this peaceful, land where they make chocolate and they are bankers and they have gold and beautiful mountains, pristine mountains, and so on and so forth, and all of that is true and worthy of applauding. They have not engaged in colonialism, they have not engaged in imperialism, all of this is 100% true. What people often don't talk about is, number one, their ancestors, the Swiss pikemen, were ferocious warriors who gave no quarter, meaning they took no prisoners, they just unalived everyone they came across. And no, that was not normal for medieval warfare. That was actually barbaric by the standards of the time. And number two, that Switzerland has a strong military tradition. To this day, they maintain bunkers in the Alps, a large amount of citizen gun ownership, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of the war machine that Deleuze talks about. So it's always going to be there, even in peaceful nations like the beautiful nation of Switzerland. So Martin Deleuze argues that in order for there to be peace, you have to accept a multiplicity, that there's you're going to live in a world in which you're going to have state actors with multiple motivations trying to do multiple different things. This is what Switzerland achieved. So, what he emphasizes is plural coexistence rather than forced uniformity. So, for example, George Bush II in 2003 talked about the march of democracy, that we need to spread democracy across the planet. Martin Deleuze argues the opposite. He doesn't say that democracy is a bad thing inherently, but that nations are going to look different. There's going to be diversity within and among nations, and that the key to peace is learning to accept this and work within this framework. And the US can do this. They have proven themselves capable of doing this. And I'll give you two examples of nations where they've proven themselves capable of doing this. Actually, three examples, and I'll save the third example for last. The Kingdom of Tonga, not a democracy, a monarchy. The Kingdom of Thailand, again, not a democracy, a monarchy. And, perhaps most infamously, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And why do I bring them up? Because at least the first two are secular in principle. Saudi Arabia is inherently theocratic, and yet the US finds the ability to tolerate them. And so what Martin Deleuze argues is that this is vital to peace, that we just need to accept multiplicity, as he calls it, or as I would rather call it, diversity. And so, peace is more likely when states recognize that every political community seeks survival, that defensive capacity is part of sovereignty, and that stability arises from mutual tolerance of difference, not coercive control. Number 4, the problem of exceptional appeals. So I wanted to get into this because of Israel. So appeals to the security concerns of allies, such as those of Israel, are politically understandable, but nonetheless are a case of special pleading. It's a case of special pleading with regards to the Christian Zionists, and it's a case of special pleading with regards to a tiny, paranoid, foreign nation. It doesn't really hold merit materially. So a Deleuzian sort of critique would warn against allowing any single state's security narrative to dominate the entire geopolitical field, which is essentially what's happening right now. So when one perspective becomes sort of hegemonic, it re-territorializes, that's a Deleuzian term, global politics around a single fear, intensifying cycles of militarization rather than diffusing them. A more stable system acknowledges that all actors perceive threats and therefore pursue deterrence. So, the Deleuzian ethical conclusion. So, the ethical implication is pragmatic rather than moralistic. That is what Martin Deleuze prescribes as, pragmatic sort of solutions instead of purely moralistic concerns. And so, For the sake of peace and human life, the United States should move away from a paranoid framework of absolute prohibition and toward a multipolar tolerance of state self-defense. Such an approach would recognize the inevitability of military development by sovereign states, reduce the incentives for secrecy and escalation, and prioritize diplomacy and coexistence over coercive containment. In Deleuzian terms, peace emerges not from suppressing the flows of power that drive states to defend themselves, but from learning how to live within those flows without forcing them into rigid, violent confrontations. That is the lesson of Martin Gilles Deleuze when it comes to the present horrible conflict between the US and Iran.